Welcome back to the Old History Project YouTube channel. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please see the description below for links to my Facebook page and podcast. Welcome back to the channel. In repeating fashion, this week's video will be over the Morristown, Cumberland Gap, and Ohio Railroad that ran from Morristown, Tennessee through Grainger County and into Luttrell. But before we begin, please be sure to give my buddy Michael Cook at Sauce Squatch a look-see for all your barbecuing needs. Now, most people today don't know that Morristown, Tennessee had its own railroad. Well, it did, and here is its story. But before we talk about the good old Peavine, let's dive into its roots. The Cincinnati, Cumberland Gap, and Charleston Railroad Company was first chartered on November the 18th, 1853, by an act of the General Assembly of Tennessee. Now, information on this railroad is very limited. However, from what I have read, and there are sources in the description, the proposed start destination for this railroad was going to be in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it was going to end in Charleston, South Carolina. This would have given East Tennessee a direct trade path with that of the rest of the world. It would have traveled directly through Morristown, across the French Broad, the Pigeon River, and Appalachian Mountains, and went on down to the port city of Charleston. It is thought that this railroad, if it were completed, would have been one of the longest railroads in the country prior to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And an interesting fact, one Lawson D. Franklin, the first millionaire of Tennessee, funded a very large portion of the building of this railroad. However, when it came time to turn the page to the 1860s chapter of America, the war between the states happened. The railroad would be forced to halt all operations, as all ordinary business was suspended due to the goings-on during the war, with hostile armies going on everywhere, all this, that, and the other. Now, prior to this, the company had actually graded from the French Broad all the way into Morristown. It had bridges built, had cross ties laid, and it was ready for iron rail. The workers would work all the way up until the spring of 1862. Now, when the war ended, the first post-war meeting took place in 1867 at the office in Morristown, where the president of the company dictated to its board of directors that the work done thus far had sustained considerable damage. The ties were taken, the bridge over Long Creek had been torn down, the iron hauled off, the timber burned up and destroyed, and a large amount of timber for the bridge over the French Broad River had been carried off. And later on in the minutes, it tells us that a section of the line that had been completed between the French Broad and the Pigeon Rivers, talking about the line to Newport, had been destroyed by an unprecedented flood of both rivers and swept away most of the work done. The rest of the minutes dictate the struggles happening and more talk of the Great Flood of 1867, which they called unprecedented at that time. This work would never fully get completed, and the end fate of the C, CG, and C is never mentioned in any of the sources I have read. Perhaps it went bankrupt. In the 1880s, an effort to revive the proposed line from Morristown to Cincinnati was revived. This company would build a rail linking Morristown to Grainger County, and then the rail would go on through Rutledge and into Luttrell, where it connected with the Knoxville, Cumberland Gap, and Louisville Railroad. And it then linked up with the L&N, and then later on the Kentucky Central, that went through Kentucky and reached a terminus in Cincinnati, Ohio. There were plans to build a rail connecting Bean Station to Bristol, as the RR had high hopes of capitalizing on the marble industry. Of course, those plans were never fulfilled. Now, I'll pause for a moment so everyone can see the exact path of the railroad in orange, with the proposed route to Bristol shown in the dotted blue line. A link to this map in the description. Instead, they would serve as both passenger and freight service, doing coal hauls to the Morristown power plant and carrying more prominent citizens to a spur that went to the Tate Springs Resort, as well as carrying citizens to and fro the aforementioned counties. Now, the railroad would come to be known as, and is still called, the Peavine. The MCG&O would be bought out by Southern between the 1890s and 1900s, no doubt because of the economic crises going on during that decade. Passenger travel by train would sort of die out by the 20s and 30s as the vehicle became more affordable and was quicker than a train at that time. The Peavine would resort to freight service until the late 1930s, when TVA began buying land for the proposed flood zone of the soon-to-be created Cherokee Lake. All of the rails from the Holston River to Rutledge were pulled, and the now spur would be used for car storage for several decades, ending somewhere off of Shields Ferry Road, until they too would be pulled. Remnants of the rail going this way can still be seen in the TVA Noeton management area. Now, going east, the railroad largely followed the same path that it does today. Only very minor alterations have been made over the years. However, the first iteration of the railroad going this way was called the Morristown and Charleston Railroad, but that was later changed to the Morristown and Paint Rock Railroad. It would also be bought by the Southern Railroad around the same time as the acquisition of the MCG&O. Now, for almost 50 years, the original vision of the Cincinnati-Cumberland Gap in Charleston was fulfilled, and a lot of business was brought to the people of East Tennessee by this railroad. Now, had the original Charleston, Cincinnati, and Cumberland Gap been completed, history may have played out very differently for the towns along its original route. Maybe Morristown and Bean Station would be bigger cities, being served by two different railroads that connected it with all major cities and a port city. It's fun stuff to think about. Thanks for watching.